What's up everybody? My name is Pantsface and today we're talking about Hodir. I'll talk about what you can do to increase your damage on this fight, as well as strategies your guild can use to try to beat the 2-minute timer for hard mode. While this fight does have a decent amount of RNG, if your raid plays smart you can learn to consistently beat that 2-minute timer for hard mode. In the fight portion of the video, I'll give you some tips and tricks that your raid can utilize to try to beat the 2-minute timer. So even though this is a Shadow Priest guide, that part of the video will be useful for everybody. Without further ado, let's get into it. First up, let's talk talents. So as a Shadow Priest, I honestly don't think you need to change your talents for this fight. Whatever preset you use for ulduar should be fine. But the one suggestion I will make is that it's possible threat may be an issue. Now fortunately, Shadow does have a 30% threat reduction in Shadow form, but if you're finding threat to be an issue, then you can put some points into Shadow Affinity. I would move points from Improved Mind Blast into Shadow Affinity, as we won't be using Mind Blast during the most important parts of this fight, and I'll talk about that in the rotation section. Again, I don't think you need to change your talents, but if threat is an issue, then it could be worthwhile. Next up, let's talk gearing. So similar to General Vezix, we want to gear for as much critical strike rating as possible. This is because of two buffs we get during the fight. Starlight is a haste buff granted by standing in the white beams of light, and Storm Power increases our critical strike damage by 135%. Considering the strength of these two buffs, we want to maximize our damage by utilizing any crit gear we have. So if you happen to salvage any non-disc crit items for 10 or 25 man, this is the time to use them. Trinkets and our non-tier slots are what you want to swap, so if you have the gear to swap, I would definitely recommend it. Next up, let's talk about the rotation. So if you get the Storm buff, it's important to note how your rotation may change. Shadow Priests only want to cast Mind Flake and use Devouring Plague if you need to move. Affliction Warlocks will only cast Shadow Bolt and maintain Corruption. So even if they're in execute range, they don't use Drain Soul because Drain Soul does not crit. Fire Mages don't want to use Hot Streak procs, as the ignite damage lost from Ignite Munching is less damage than continually casting Fireball. These rotation changes only matter when we have the Storm Power buff, so make sure to do your rotation normally until you get Storm Power. If you're a class with dots, then you have to understand how dots work in this fight. First up, let's talk about the Singed debuff on Hodir. Since this is not a buff on your character, your dots will automatically have this applied to them. So even if you cast your first dots when there are 0 stacks of this buff, as you get more stacks onto Hodir, your dots will gradually deal more damage. Now Storm Power and the haste buff from the beams behave differently. If you're a class that can refresh a dot, such as Shadow Priest with Shadow Word Pain or Affliction Warlocks with Corruption, then whenever you refresh the duration of these dots, these buffs will automatically be applied to them. Obviously haste does not benefit Shadow Word Pain, so it's not going to be getting the haste buff, but the crit buff will be transferred to both of those spells automatically. Now for any other dots you have, Vampiric Touch, Devouring Plague, Unstable Affliction, those need to be recast when you get the buff, as it will not automatically be applied. So if you cast a spell and then go stand in a beam and get a store buff, you will have to recast those spells in order for them to benefit. Now let's talk about the fight itself. On pull, you want to kill the icicles that have trapped the NPCs. Warlocks can start casting Seed of Corruption a few seconds before your pull timer is done, as this will get you a nice burst of damage on some of the icicles at the beginning of the fight. Melee should focus on one side and range should focus on the other. After the icicles are broken, make sure not to stand too close to the freed NPCs. This is because every single NPC has a spell they will cast, and if you stand near them and they get hit by the falling icicles, it will interrupt their cast and they might not cast it, which can severely hurt your DPS on this fight. The mage NPCs will drop campfires. Standing near these provides a buff to your character, and attacking Hodir with spells applies a debuff called Singed to Hodir. Singed is a debuff that provides 2% increase to magic damage taken, up to 50% at 25 stacks. It is imperative that this is stacked at all times, and this is more important to stack than it is to stand in beams at the beginning of the fight. Every range should be standing near a campfire to make sure this gets stacked to 25 stacks immediately. If you stand still on this fight, then every 4 seconds you will receive a stacking debuff called Biting Cold. The damage will double for every stack that you receive, but standing near a campfire removes all stacks and prevents it from stacking. If you're not near a campfire, you should make sure this doesn't get too high so that you're not taking too much damage. Once Singed hits 25 stacks, all range should spread out to the white beams. One ranged DPS should be responsible for maintaining Singed on Hodir, as the debuff only lasts 25 seconds. A Boomkin or Hunter are great for doing this, but they probably won't be able to stand in beams while maintaining this buff. That's okay, it's more important for this buff to be maintained for all of your casters than it is for that one person to do a lot of damage on this fight. Now the beams give a 50% haste buff, so all range should be stacked in these once Singed is fully stacked. If a lot of ranged are standing together, then there can be a lot of icicles falling from the sky. These are telegraphed by small blue circles on the ground, so try to avoid these the best you can. If you get hit by them, they'll do damage and knock you away from the beams, so it's better to step out of the beams preemptively than it is to get hit by them. Every 30 seconds, the Shaman NPCs will cast Storm Cloud on a member of your raid. This player can spread the Storm Power buff to other players. Note that the player that gets Storm Cloud does not necessarily have Storm Power, as these are two separate buffs. Since all of your range should be stacked in the beams, whoever gets this buff should run to ranged immediately, even if it's a melee or tank. Melee in this fight really play the role of support, as most of the damage should be coming from your range. They should do their best to not stand near range so that they don't put extra icicles onto them, but if they get the Storm Cloud, they need to run to ranged immediately. Spreading the Storm Cloud does not happen instantly. You'll have to wait for the buff to tick, which happens every second or two. You can't brush up against somebody and immediately leave, so you'll have to wait for a few seconds in order to pass the buff. At this point, casters are going to be doing a ton of threat, so rogues and hunters need to use misdirection and tricks of the trade on cooldown on your tanks. Without this, your casters are going to be pulling threat and they're probably going to die. The final ability to note is called Flash Freeze. So every 50 seconds, Hodir will cast this spell. 2 giant icicles will fall from the sky. After they fall, everybody in your raid must go stack in that area that they hit, otherwise they will be frozen into ice cubes. This will freeze all of the NPCs, so they need to be broken out again in order to benefit from their buffs. After the NPCs are freed, the fight is rinse and repeat. So keep Singed stacked, stand in beams, spread Storm buff, and try not to die, and you'll kill the boss in 2 minutes. Now, this fight does take practice and coordination to beat the 2-minute timer, but once you figure it out, you'll be consistently one-shotting hard mode, and you'll be one step closer to taking on Algalon. That's all for this guide. I hope it helped you out, and I hope your guild secures a kill soon if you haven't killed hard mode already. My name's Pantsface, and I'll see you in the next one.